Welcome to my channel. Deepwater Horizon oil rig. 2010. Thank you to my viewer, who suggested today's content. The Deepwater Horizon oil rig was located off the Gulf of Mexico. It was owned and operated by offshore oil drilling company, Transocean. It was leased by oil company BP. The rig was a 9-year-old, semi-submersible, mobile floating rig, which could operate in water up to 10,000 feet deep. It was on the evening of April 20, 2010, that a surge of natural gas blasted through a concrete core, which had recently been installed. The core was too weak to withstand the pressure, because of substandard concrete. When the core was fractured, the natural gas traveled up the rig's riser to the platform, and then ignited and exploded. 94 crew members were rescued by lifeboats and helicopters. 17 of the crew were treated for their injuries. It's believed that there were 126 people on board at the time of the explosion. Sadly, 11 of the workers were killed that night. The bodies of these 11 workers would never be found, even though a search was conducted by the U.S. Coast Guard. They are thought to have died in the explosion. The Deepwater Horizon oil rig would sink on April 22, rupturing the riser, and causing oil to begin leaking into the ocean. More than 200 million gallons of crude oil was pumped into the Gulf of Mexico for a total of 87 days. 16,000 total miles of coastline were affected by the spill, including the coasts of Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. A containment dome was placed over the largest leak, but this failed, so the company tried other methods, but again all these failed, and oil continued to leak into the ocean, and spread. President Obama announced that his administration would create a $20 billion spill response fund. 5.5 million feet of boom, a barrier placed in the water to collect and absorb oil, was used to try and clean up the spill. The cleanup continued until June 2013. Over 8,000 animals were reported dead in just 6 months after the spill, which included many that were already on the endangered species list. Tourism also began to struggle, with oil still seen on beaches. After an investigation, it was found that BP was ultimately responsible for the disaster. A report noted that a defective concrete cap had been installed by Halliburton, with decisions about the installation being made by BP. It was discovered that BP and Transocean employees on board the rig ignored early indications of a problem during testing, which resulted in the missed opportunity to prevent the blowout, and preventing this disaster. In 2012, BP agreed to settle claims made by plaintiffs. It is said that BP were responsible for $40 billion in fines, cleanup costs, and settlements, with an additional $16 billion fine due to the Clean Water Act. Over 30,000 people responded to the spill, cleaning beaches and taking care of animals. In November 2012, BP reached an agreement with the DOJ to plead guilty to criminal charges, with 11 counts of felony manslaughter. In July 2013, Halliburton agreed to pay out $200,000 after pleading guilty to criminal charges, where its employees had destroyed evidence relating to the spill. In November 2012, Robert Kaluza and Donald Vidrine were charged with manslaughter. However, these charges would be dropped in 2015. No one was ever charged for the death of the victims, and no one ever sent to prison for these deaths. These victims received no justice for their deaths. It has been reported that even 10 years after the disaster, oil continued to harm wildlife. Experts say little has changed since the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and say that an incident like this could happen again. The remains of the Deepwater Horizon rig are said to still be resting on the seabed today. Remembering the victims of that tragic night. Jason Anderson, aged 35. Jason left behind a wife, daughter, and son. It has been reported by his wife that on the day of the disaster, Jason wasn't supposed to be on the Deepwater Horizon rig. He was transferring to another rig, and had gone there to train his new replacement. Aaron Dale Burkeen, aged 37. Aaron was a crane operator on the rig. He left behind a wife, daughter, and son. On the day of the disaster, it was his wedding anniversary. His birthday would have been on April 24. Survivors said that the blast blew him off the catwalk, where he fell more than 50 feet to the deck. Donald Clark, aged 49. Donald was an assistant driller. He left behind a wife and 4 children. He had been married for 20 years. His wife chose not to have an empty grave for her husband, saying that he is remembered through his children. Stephen Ray Curtis, aged 39. Stephen was an assistant driller. He left behind a wife, daughter, son and grandchild. He was also a member of Georgetown Volunteer Fire Department. Gordon Jones, aged 28. Gordon was a drilling fluid specialist. He left behind a wife and 2 sons. Sadly, he never got to meet his second son. He was born just weeks after his death. The couple were just days away from celebrating their 6th wedding anniversary. Roy Wyatt Kemp, aged 27. Roy left behind his wife and 2 daughters. It has been reported that just weeks before the explosion, he had hinted to his wife that there were problems on the rig, and had started making plans for his funeral. Carl Kleppinger Jr., aged 38. Carl was a floor hand, and also a military veteran. He left behind his wife and son. The couple loved animals. Keith Blair Manuel, aged 56. Keith was a senior drilling fluid specialist. He left behind his fiancée, 3 daughters, and grandson. He was known on the rig as Papa Bear. He had been planning on marrying his fiancée when he was killed. Dewey Rivette, aged 48. Dewey was a chief driller. He left behind his wife and 2 daughters. It was reported that he had argued with one of the BP supervisors before the disaster. This BP supervisor was one of the men charged with manslaughter. His 2 grandsons were born later, and would be named after him. Shane Rocheteau, aged 22. Shane was a floor hand. He left behind a wife and son. Before working on the Deepwater Horizon, he had been studying to be a medical radiologist. Adam Visa, aged 24. Adam had purchased a house in Yorktown, Texas, which he was proud of. He didn't even mind driving 10 hours every 3 weeks to go onto the rig. Adam did not have any children. He left behind his mother. Sadly, to this day, none of the victims' bodies have ever been discovered. A memorial to the victims, known as 11, was erected in 2016 in the Marigny neighborhood of New Orleans. The memorial was there for 2 years, before it was moved in 2018, to St. Rose, Louisiana. The figures were made from unbendable steel, said to represent the strength and heroism of these fallen men. Our hearts go out to the families of these brave men. May your loved ones never be forgotten. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to my channel to view other content.